So a lot of you guys have been asking me to make a video about Billy Kaplan in Marvel Comics. No doubt this is because of the teen from Agatha All Along. And a lot of people are theorizing that it's Billy, aka Wiccan, or the Demiurge to come if you read Marvel Comics. I'll explain what that means here in a little while. I will preface all this by saying Billy is way more powerful than the Scarlet Witch, and you'll see what I'm talking about here. But as crazy as this sounds, Billy's whole story alongside his brother Tommy goes all the way back to Franklin Richards. And that's one of the reasons why we made the video that we made about Franklin destroying Mephisto, because that's what happened, right? In the old Fantastic Four 276 and 277, as well as Doctor Strange Volume 2, issue number 75, if you're inclined to read it, that it basically had this story where Mephisto had essentially kidnapped Franklin Richards, and depending on how you want to interpret it, was drawing on Franklin's powers in order to enhance his own abilities. Eventually, Doctor Strange basically rescues the Fantastic Four and frees Franklin. And when that happens, Franklin destroys Mephisto on the spot, like literally kills him, right? As much as you can kill the living embodiment of evil, right? Of course, Mephisto will always return because evil will always exist. But that goes directly into the Vision and Scarlet Witch comic book series, which most of you guys are probably familiar with this bit of history when it comes to Tommy and Billy, but it can't hurt to kind of refresh it a little bit. What we know in the Vision and Scarlet Witch comic series is that Scarlet Witch just like popped up pregnant with a couple of kids, and nobody really knew how. It was one of those things where like Scarlet Witch is like, yeah, Vision and I are gonna have babies, and people are kind of like, but I mean, like, he's a robot though. So like, how did that happen? Right? Like Scarlet Witch was stepping outside the marriage, but it's one of those things, right? It was a little wonky at the time. Suffice it to say, like, they ultimately end up having those children. Now, eventually what happens is Mephisto reconstitutes himself with the exception of two missing pieces. And that's where you go into like the West Coast Avengers or Avengers West Coast. I always forget which comic run it is, and it's not overly important here. But in effect, Mephisto sends out a low-level villain named Master Pandemonium in order to reclaim his missing souls. And it's in that story arc from West Coast Avengers that you learn the two missing pieces of Mephisto's soul are Tommy and Billy. And so as a result of that, those missing fragments are returned to Mephisto, the kids cease to exist, Wanda has a mental breakdown, and Agatha Harkness wipes her mind. And so Wanda totally forgets that she ever had kids. Now, for years in Marvel Comics, this was like the status quo. When I say years, I mean like a few decades, until Brian Michael Bendis started setting the stage in the early 2000s for the House of M storyline. What he did is he gave us a story called Avengers Disassembled. This is important because we'll reference this again here in a little while. But while Avengers Disassembled largely focused on the revelation that Wanda was using chaos magic, something the fans had been hypothesizing for years in Marvel Comics, what it also did is it built on that story from Master Pandemonium and West Coast Avengers where she lost her kids. And we ended up finding out that Wanda essentially seemed to remember that she had kids. Now, it really came by way of Wasp, who kind of made this offhanded remark, but she was convinced that she had kids. Initially, she was convinced the Avengers stole them, and then she went and confronted Agatha Harkness, where she basically learned the reality of what had happened. Following that, she basically sought revenge on the Avengers, and so that's why during the Avengers Disassembled event, she like uses her reality warping powers to basically manifest an entire Kree armada above Avengers Mansion. Hawkeye gets killed. She uses her powers to trick Tony Stark into appearing drunk on national television. Stark Industries stock plummets. He can't really fund the Avengers anymore, hence the namesake of the story, the Avengers disband. And that basically goes directly into the House of M storyline, when Magneto shows up and he takes the Scarlet Witch away after her seeming defeat, and then ultimately Xavier and Magneto decide that she has to die in order to save reality, right? Because she's essentially losing control of her ability to manipulate chaos magic, and that combined with her mental instability, hell's bells, God only knows what would happen to all of reality. And so if you guys are interested in House of M, I'll post a link to it at the end of this video. It's a really, really fascinating story. But coming out of that, there were a lot of unresolved questions about the historical aspect of her kids, because it was one thing to have them kind of wiped away during the West Coast Avengers storyline and her mind being wiped. But when Brian Michael Bendis brought it back up and established that like this is a real tangible part of her history, a lot of fans were wondering how that was going to unfold. And so for a little while, and when I say a little while, I'd say maybe like a few months to about a year or so, Marvel finally got around to focusing on the nature of Wanda's kids. Now, what was really interesting about this is that initially it wasn't something that Marvel just kind of threw to us, right? It wasn't as though they were just like, and now a one-shot comic called Scarlet Witch's kids, the follow-up to all the stuff that we revealed but never really did anything with. Instead, what we got was the launch of Young Avengers under Alan Heinberg and Jim Chung. But the funny thing about this is that you go into like issue number 3, and that's about as far as you get with regards to Billy giving any real revelation of who he is, outside of saying that he was basically born to a couple of people up in, Upper West Side, New York City. And like that was it. It wasn't until December of 2005 that Marvel came out with the Young Avengers special. And what they did is they essentially gave us kind of origin stories, or a sort of tour de force of the Young Avengers teammates. And specifically when it came to Billy, there was a point when he had encountered the Scarlet Witch. And that what ended up happening is that the Scarlet Witch had just kind of healed his injuries after being bullied, and seemingly that activated powers that he had. Now, the biggest issue that Marvel had at the time, and what they've still seemingly struggled with, is they never really reconciled how Billy got his powers outside of the fact that he was just kind of the son of the Scarlet Witch and hand-waving it away. But the other issue that this comic presented was that Billy had met Wanda before the events of Avengers Disassembled. So neither Wanda nor Billy knew who the other was, in the sense that Billy knew Wanda was an Avenger, but he didn't know she was his mom, and she didn't know she was his mom. So it was effectively strangers meeting each other. Now, it did make for some really interesting storytelling, in the sense that we as the reader knew what was going on, but the two characters didn't. And it kind of remained that way for a little while in Marvel Comics. And in fact, it wasn't until Young Avengers issue number 11 that there was any real explanation of how it was that Billy and his brother Tommy were related to Wanda and Vision as basically being their kids. Instead, a lot of the early issues of Young Avengers served two purposes. One was to like introduce the team to us, right? And say like they're essentially a kind of backup program that was devised by Vision, that in case the Avengers ever went belly up or they were killed or something like that, that a new initiative would be launched, right? That like these individuals would be brought together and they would become the Young Avengers. The second thing that it did is it basically fleshed out the nature of the individual members themselves, which is to say their interpersonal relationships and doing things like going and grabbing Tommy, right? Rescuing him as the twin brother of Billy and so on and so forth. But once you get to issue number 11 and the family business storyline, that you basically have this reconciliation. And what we end up finding out is that Teddy, who is not related to Tommy or Billy, but is actually dating Billy, that Teddy was essentially the heir and really kind of a hybrid between the Kree and the Skrulls. Within the confines of the story, that matters because what had basically happened is the Kree and the Skrull Empire were vying for Teddy, either trying to kill him or trying to capture him or something along those lines. But during all of this, there is a point where Vision essentially spills the beans. And what Vision does is it kind of runs over the history of Wanda, at least what we've already talked about, because the story was new to a lot of different readers. More so than that, what it also did is it built on the existing narrative that had been established in the old Vision and Scarlet Witch, West Coast Avengers, Brian Michael Bendis, Avengers Disassembled storyline, and it said that according to the former Vision's memory files, the Scarlet Witch was so desperate to have children, she unconsciously used her reality-altering powers to create twin boys, Thomas and William, out of two lost souls. Souls which were later claimed by Mephisto, Lord of the Netherworld, as his own. However, when Mephisto reabsorbed the twin souls, they had basically been modified. They had been so transfigured by Wanda's magic that they destroyed the demon and dispersed. Thomas and William ceased to exist, as did the Scarlet Witch's memory of them, until recently, when grief-stricken, the Scarlet Witch lost control of her powers, inadvertently killing Ant-Man, Hawkeye, and the former Vision. Now, the cool thing about this is this actually builds on what was already happening in the story itself, in the sense that Super Skrull, basically a former villain of the Fantastic Four, a Skrull that has the Fantastic Four's powers, technically his name is Clert, that he had actually revealed to Tommy and Billy that they were the children of Wanda. And initially they didn't want to believe it, where they were like, I mean, I guess, but like Billy was the one who was like, I mean, it kind of makes perfect sense, man. We're twins. Wanda's kids were named Tommy and Billy. You and I are named Tommy and Billy, right? Like it makes perfect sense. And that's kind of what you get to this follow-up revelation by the Vision. Now, the other part of this, and something that was kind of toyed here, was that Vision was not the actual father of Wanda's kids. As far as I'm aware, I don't think this plot thread ever really gets chased down by Marvel. And if it didn't, it's not a great big huge deal. If it did, let me know, but I'm pretty sure it didn't. I've been hunting around and I couldn't really find a definitive answer to it. But what's important is this was the first time in Marvel that Marvel actually started to reconcile the histories of these two characters and bringing back those old plot threads and actually giving them a place within Marvel Comics itself in relation to Scarlet Witch. Now, the biggest issue at this point in time, and kind of taking a step away from Billy per se, is that Marvel in the mid-2000s, as most of you guys will remember, was just kind of like the event age, as a lot of us call it, right? Back-to-back events, right? There was the whole of the X-Men universe in the aftermath of House of M, right? So the reduction of the mutant population down to 198 mutants, and basically Cyclops leading what was left of the mutants, trying to figure out a safe haven and try not to be killed, and so on and so forth. But within Marvel as a whole, and largely spearheaded by Brian Michael Bendis, it was back-to-back stories, right? So Civil War, Secret Invasion, the whole of Dark Reign, all that kind of stuff, Siege on Asgard. And so I wouldn't go so far as to say that the story of Billy figuring out his lineage in relation to Wanda was lost in the shuffle. And the reason why is because there was a mini-series written by Roberto Sacasa, I think is how you pronounce his name, that came out in 2008 that was called Young Avengers Presents Wiccan and Speed. And so all this did was basically begin the process of these two trying to find Wanda in the aftermath of House of M, because she had kind of vanished, right? She was just sort of out there doing her own thing. That eventually comes to a head in a story called The Children's Crusade, which we'll talk about here in a second. I know a lot of you guys are probably excited about that. Children's Crusade was great. That story was so good. Oh my God, it was amazing. But the thing that I really want to kind of solidify here is that during this point in time, because you had things like Dark Reign and Fear Itself, Civil War, all that kind of stuff, Billy and Tommy, outside of the Young Avengers Presents miniseries, were just kind of like a part of these events, right? They were just in there doing some things, and that was really about it. It was cool that Marvel would do things like give them their own individual focus so that fans didn't forget about everything that was going on. But Children's Crusade is kind of where we jump to next, right? Because what happens with Children's Crusade is a couple different things. The first is that ultimately Wanda is discovered, but she's basically amnesiac and she's supposed to get married to Dr. Doom. The second thing this does is it actually leads to Iron Lad taking Wanda into the past in order to restore her memories. Now, just for the fun of it and to throw something a little extra into this video, let's talk about Iron Lad for a second. And I'm about to take a really complex thing and make it incredibly simple. Let's say, for example, that right now you're like a Harvard graduate and you have some job where you make like $1 million a year. And for whatever reason, you're afraid that like something may happen in the past that could prevent that from happening, right? So what you do is you go to your teenage self and you say, hey, look, you're gonna do these things, right? You're gonna do like these series of events that are gonna make sure that you go to Harvard, you're gonna apply for this job, and then you're gonna make $1 million a year, right? That's what Iron Lad is, right? Except in this instance, you are Kang the Conqueror, and you go into the past. Your teenage self is Iron Lad, except Iron Lad didn't want to become a bad guy. Kang was trying to make him a villain, and Iron Lad was like, no, I don't want to be a villain. I want to be a hero. That's how that works. But that's why Iron Lad was able to take Scarlet Witch into the past, because he has the ability to manipulate time. By taking Scarlet Witch into the past, she basically had to confront all the things that she had done. And it was amazing, right? Because you got to see just like the other half of this. Now, another thing that the story established, and I'm not really sure how I felt about this, was that it said Wanda was as powerful as she was during House of M because she had tapped into something called the life force. It wasn't just an inherent power to herself. That was Marvel basically nerfing the abilities of the Scarlet Witch, reducing what she was actually capable of, as opposed to just saying like, she's a crazy woman with crazy powers, and like she took out 98% of the mutant population, and that's it. I kind of prefer that she was just a crazy girl with crazy powers, but still. What ends up happening towards the end of this story, specifically with issue number 8, I think it is, that there comes a point when Tommy and Billy approach her, specifically Billy, and he starts talking to her, right? And he basically says like, we're your children, right? Like we are your kids. And one of the things that Wanda says is that she had done everything she did because she wanted the Avengers to experience the loss that she had experienced, right? The loss of her children, the loss of the life she could have had. And so she destroys what the Avengers could have been. And the result of that is when she's confronted with all of this, Billy tells her, use your powers, right? And that will tell you the truth. She does, and then she hugs him, and we find out they're actually the children of Scarlet Witch. So that's how all those things kind of come together and reconcile. Now, following that, the story of Billy, if we're being quite honest, until you get to like Kieran Gillen's Young Avengers Volume 2, that it is largely just sort of him out there in the world doing heroic stuff. I would go so far as to say that I think a lot of these stories manifested the way they did with regards to Billy and Tommy because their story was effectively done, right? Once Children's Crusade came along, there wasn't really any more origin to flesh out. There wasn't any more backstory to establish, and so now they were officially in Marvel Comics, and they were off to the races. I wouldn't say their stories were bad. It was really focusing a lot on like Billy and Teddy having a relationship and being in love and all that kind of cool stuff. Now, the love aspect and the relationship aspect was a huge part of what happened during Kieran Gillen's Young Avengers. And while not everything in that story is overly important, a lot of you guys in your travels may have heard the idea that Billy is supposed to become the Demiurge. Now, I'll explain what that means because more recently in Immortal Thor, which we covered, Marvel's kind of shifted that up. But the idea is that during Kieran Gillen's run, there was this kind of like extra dimensional entity called Mother. I know it sounds weird, it's strange. The idea is that it's just an organism out there that feeds on realities and beings of incredible power. And it was chasing after Billy among other people. But it was basically Kieran Gillen establishing that there was a lot more to Billy than we'd initially been led to believe. Because over the course of his comic book appearances leading up to this point, Billy had displayed pretty incredible levels of power. Initially, it was just like manipulating electromagnetism, and that was it. And so a lot of fans theorized that if he was the child of Scarlet Witch, he had really kind of inherited Magneto's powers through the Scarlet Witch. But as time went on, and when he changed his name from Asgardian to Wiccan, because he was actually manipulating magic as opposed to just modeling himself after Thor and essentially creating lightning, that he started using like incredible levels of power, right? Things that were, by all standards of measurement from your and my perspective, reality warping, right? Now, they weren't ultra high levels of reality warping, but it was reality warping nonetheless. And so during Kieran Gillen's run, there comes a point when, in essence, Billy comes face to face with Mother, but also talks to Loki, who at this point was reborn after the events of Siege on Asgard, and Loki was basically a teenager. Don't worry about what that means. If you don't know what it means, don't think too hard about it. What's important here is that there was this kind of premonition in the story when they were in alternate reality that said that Billy's supposed to become the Demiurge. And so Loki effectively told Billy, you're going to have to learn how to harness this power. You're going to have to learn to become the Demiurge. Now, what does that mean? Okay, let's take a step away from Billy and Tommy and everything with the Young Avengers. Let's talk about the Elder Gods. So in Marvel Comics, way back in the day in the old Thor comics, what we learned is that at some point on Earth, you had a bunch of Elder Gods, Chthon, Sidorak, all that kind of stuff. And for those of you guys who have heard this explanation, bear with me, there's probably people who haven't. What Marvel did here is they said that Chthon, really leading the charge as you would expect from an evil guy, sent the Elder Gods down this path of degeneracy, where they were effectively killing each other and absorbing each other's powers. Demiurge was initially a tomb, basically the son of Gaia, right? Mother Earth, more or less, and the mother of Thor. And that a tomb had gone through and basically become the Demiurge and wiped out almost all the Elder Gods. Those who didn't die fled to alternate dimensions, and they left artifacts behind on Earth so that some poor sap would start messing with it, having no idea what they're doing, and basically become a vessel for that person, right? Chthon left the Darkhold, Set left the Serpent Crown, and Sidorak left the Crimson Gem, and all the other members of the Octessence more or less did the same thing, and so on and so forth. But the Demiurge, for the longest time in Marvel, was just a really powerful Elder God who destroyed other Elder Gods. Basically, an Elder God more powerful than Chthon and those guys, right? More recently in Immortal Thor, what they established was that there's the Demiurge primordial, and then there's those individuals who can tap into the Demiurge's power, which is a very uncommon thing. And so for someone like Wiccan, when he taps into the Demiurge's power, it amplifies his abilities several times over. So take the most powerful earthbound reality warper that you could imagine, and then like multiply their power by a factor of 10, right? Some base 10 number. And that's what Billy is, right? When he becomes a Demiurge. So much so that during Kieran Gillen's Young Avengers Volume 2 run, there's a point when he defeats Mother, and then he starts walking around the multiverse, right? Literally walking on the multiverse itself. He transcended all of existence. Now, the issue with this, and this is where things get kind of wonky, is technically tapping into the Demiurge's power is a bit of a modification. And he was only able to do it because of the fact that essentially he and Teddy had a kind of falling out, and then Teddy Teddy reappeared and they reconciled, right? So love is what allowed him to channel that extra power that he had. What is kind of weird about that though, is that in order to become the Demiurge, you kind of have to like sever yourself from all really like mortal connections, like individuals becoming Jedi. So through love, he disconnected and then became the Demiurge. But it is important to know that the idea of Billy potentially becoming the Demiurge was not just some plot device created during Kieran Gillen's run on Young Avengers and was just never referenced again until Immortal Thor. It actually became a main part of his character's arcs over the course of his time in Marvel. Specifically, in New Avengers Volume 4 is part of All New, All Different Marvel. In the first 6 issues of that run, what you actually end up seeing are a couple different things. The first part of the story deals with a guy by the name of Mordun, who, according to Al Ewing in the newer work that he did in Defenders Beyond, is a guy who hails from what's called the 5th cosmos, right? The 5th universe, multiverse, whatever you want to call it. But Mordun is a being of incredible magical power, but even he is dwarfed by the power of Wiccan. And so what his whole plot basically saw was him just like trying to possess Wiccan, right? So he could take control of his power and then essentially conquer all of reality, right? Villain of the week type stuff. Initially, it was believed he was destroyed by Billy and the rest of the New Avengers, only for the New Avengers in the future to come to the present day and basically establish that like Billy's still possessed. They just don't know it. He's possessed on a subconscious level, and Mordun is biding his time and is slowly influencing Billy, which he'd been doing. And so it took a combination of the New Avengers from the future and the New Avengers from the present facing off against a Mordun possessed Billy. Now, it wasn't one of these things where he literally like wiped everybody from existence, because the reality here was that Billy was fighting against Mordun as much as Mordun was trying to possess him. And it even took Teddy going into like Billy's mind and talking to him in order to help Billy regain control. All that really means is that Mordun didn't have access to the totality of Billy's powers. And thank God for that, because all of reality would have just been laid asunder. If that had happened, it would have been an absolute madhouse. But after this is when Billy just kind of starts to disappear in the realm of Marvel Comics. Not in the sense that they kill him off, but in the sense that he just doesn't really seem to have the same level of pizzazz that he had before, right? The same presence. Although he didn't have the biggest presence ever, it's simply that his story had more or less been told. So he just kind of fell rank and file with everybody else. I would go so far as to argue the most notable thing that had happened with the character of Billy really going from like Children's Crusade into All New, All Different New Avengers with Robert DaCosta is the Empire event that Marvel launched. But it wasn't really even a Billy story. It was more of a Teddy story. That actually saw the marriage between Teddy and Billy, which was pretty cool. But it was basically Teddy kind of playing the role of the unifier between the Kree and the Skrull empires and brought them both together. More recently in Marvel Comics, there was a story called The Last Annihilation, which basically saw like Dormammu trying to invade the main Marvel universe. It sounds more interesting than it was. It basically saw Wiccan teaming up with like SWORD, right, the Sentient World Observation and Response Department, in order to help Skrullos, right, the new homeworld of the Skrulls, while Hulkling basically helped alongside the Kree Empire. That was all just done because of the fact that, again, the empires were unified, so both worlds had to be defended, but it's not nearly as interesting as you think it is. The story's okay, but it's not great by any standard of measurement. But the fact is, right, Billy as a character in Marvel Comics is well beyond the powers of the Scarlet Witch when he's channeling the abilities of the Demiurge. Now, Billy versus Scarlet Witch in just their base forms, that really has some room for debate. And I'd be kind of curious, what do you guys think in the comments, right? Who do you think is more powerful in their base form, Billy or Wanda? Because I'm almost inclined to side with Billy here, to be honest with you guys. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know down in the comment section if this video helped you at all. Again, kind of clarifying the character of Billy in Marvel. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.